Everyone. Today we're going to talk about reductionist moral realism. There are a few different reductionist realists that are worth talking about, but Peter Railton is probably first among them. Peter Railton is an American philosopher who teaches at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He's best known for his work in metaethics and normative ethics, especially this particular view. Railton starts out by talking about a potential epistemic problem for moral realism. The problem is basically, if moral facts are objective, that is, they exist and they do not depend on our attitudes, how do we come to know about them? Well, there's a couple different views you might adopt here. One of them is rationalism, and this is the idea that we get at these objective moral facts by discovering them from reason itself. And this has a long history in philosophy. Plato started with this idea. Kant also made a lot out of it. Empiricism is the alternative. This is the claim that we can get to these objective moral facts. We can understand them and come to know about them by using observation and the scientific method. So Aristotle had a view somewhat like this, and arguably John Stuart Mill also had a view like this. Railton thinks that neither of these approaches have really been successful. And here's why. He says, ethical naturalism has yet to find a plausible synthesis of the empirical and the normative. The more it has given itself over to descriptive accounts of the origin of norms, the less it has retained recognizably moral force. The more it has undertaken to provide a recognizable basis for moral criticism or reconstruction, the less it has retained a firm connection with the descriptive social or psychological theory. So the basic problem here is that if you pull our understanding of ethics and right and wrong, into a more naturalistic direction, that tends to make it less forceful. It tends to not account for the intuitions that we have. The alternative, though, is not much better, really, because if we take really seriously these intuitions we have about the necessary features of morality, what often ends up happening is we posit a moral theory that isn't really compatible with a naturalistic understanding of the world or current science. Railton's overall strategy here is going to be to argue against anti-realism indirectly. And he's going to do it in the following way. So he points out that most anti-realists are motivated by the thought that there is a metaphysical, semantic, or epistemic difference between morality and science. That either there's something about the facts of morality or the structure of moral judgment or the meaning of moral statements or the way we come to know about morality that is different from how science operates, right? So anti-realism is often motivated then by a commitment to naturalism, by a commitment to the idea that the best way to understand the world is through a scientific perspective. So these people, anti-realists, are skeptical of the objectivity of morality, but not the objectivity of science. They accept the objectivity of science. And Railton's strategy here is going to be to show that morality, in the end, can be thought of as just as objective as science. Before we go on, though, I think it's important to get a terminological issue straight. So reductionism is not quite the same thing as naturalism, right? Ethical naturalism is the claim that moral properties depend on, are constituted by, or realized by natural, that is, descriptive, non-supernatural properties. Ethical reductionism is the somewhat stronger claim that moral properties reduce to, they're identical with, natural, descriptive, or non-supernatural properties. Now, as you can see, ethical reductionists are a kind of stronger version of ethical naturalists. And the reason for this is that some ethical naturalists want to be somewhat cagey about what the actual metaphysical relationship is between moral facts and descriptive ones. But reductionists just bite the bullet and say, no, there's this strong sense in which moral facts or moral language is just identical to moral or descriptive facts or descriptive language. So one way to think about this is that reductionists are a type of naturalist, but naturalists are not a type of reductionist. It's like a square rectangle situation. Now, there are two senses of reductionism, and these are not always clearly distinguished in the literature. So this is not quite a stipulation on my part, but there are these two different uses that it's put to, and it's not always really obvious which one an author has in mind. Sometimes they have both in mind. The first is semantic reduction, and this is especially in the earlier writers we're talking about in the 20th century. When somebody says that one thing reduces to another, they're talking about this semantically, right? So semantic reductionism would say that moral terms mean the same thing as descriptive terms. Contrast this with metaphysical reduction, and this is the claim that moral properties are the same thing as descriptive properties. So properties are the thing in the world, right? The features of things in the world, whereas moral terms are moral words, right? Right and wrong, good and bad, etc. Sometimes an author will use both of these, will use reductionism to mean both of these things. And in fact, this distinction wasn't really often made, I would say, until the 70s or so, with the sort of revolution in philosophy of language. Railton starts this argument by positioning it in logical space. So we're going to go through some of these things that Railton is committed to here. He's committed to cognitivism, which is the claim that moral judgments are capable of truth or falsity, or moral statements are capable of truth or falsity. He's committed to a particular view about truth, that is, that it is non-epistemic, as he puts it. What he means here is that the truth of a moral judgment or a moral statement doesn't depend on our believing or knowing that it is true. And most people think that this is the proper account of truth for other domains as well. Objectivity, so he thinks that moral properties are objective. They do not depend for their existence or nature on our attitudes, so he's going to be a moral realist. And reductionism is the claim, as we've just said, that moral properties not just supervene on natural properties, they may be in fact reducible to them. Empiricism, this is a position in the epistemology of morality. So moral inquiry, he thinks, is the same as scientific inquiry. He says it's of a piece with scientific inquiry. And bivalence, so we haven't covered anything about bivalence in this class, but it's basically the idea that for any given statement, it is either true or false. And some people think that for some domains of inquiry, bivalence does not hold. Not every statement about that domain is true or false. Other people think, no, bivalence is true about every possible domain. In this case, he says that we can't know a priori whether bivalence applies to moral judgments or not. There are also a few more positions he's got. So determinateness, he thinks we know quite a bit about morality, but our moral judgments are probably wrong in a number of ways. And he says they may be wrong in quite general ways. He thinks that reasons, motives, externalism, as Darwall would put it, is correct. So a rational agent might not always have a reason to obey moral imperatives, right? Even though those imperatives do in fact apply to him. So he's going to argue for a type of externalism later in this paper. And universality. So there are general criteria for moral assessment, he thinks, but they don't always imply, or they don't imply in general, a single set of norms for all societies and times. So it may be that the correct account of morality, of first order moral judgments or normative ethics, right, is highly context or society dependent, right? But nevertheless, he thinks it is objective. One thing that Railton has to deal with here, though, is the fact-value distinction. So philosophers often think that facts are different from values, that facts and values have a different epistemology or a different metaphysics. If this were the case, then ethical naturalism and ethical reductionism, more particularly, would be non-starters. We wouldn't be able to actually show that moral facts are just the same as descriptive ones, or that they depend on descriptive ones in some important way. Now, this argument is often put epistemically, and this is the way that Railton reconstructs it. He says, it's possible for two people to disagree about a question of value, even after they have used all rational and scientific means to solve their disagreement. And you may note the often put assumption here is that science is not this way, right? That once we use all rational and scientific means to differentiate, to solve a disagreement about some fact, right? We will ultimately solve that disagreement, right? But so the thinking goes, values are different, right? There can be fundamental disagreement that can't be ameliorated by rational and scientific means. Well, why is that? Why does that seem to be? As Railton puts it, it's because the most likely account of rationality is that it is instrumental. So reason, on this view, can tell you what means you need to accomplish your ends, right? How to get what you want, but it doesn't tell you what ends are worth having. It doesn't tell you what's worth trying to get, right? So if two people just have different ends, right, they value two different things, neither person is going to be able to rationally convince the other. They just want two different things, right? And so there's no argument that one can give to the other to show that, oh, in fact, this end is not worth valuing and mine is, right? One possible response to the fact-value distinction would be to attack the instrumental view of rationality. And in fact, Plato does this. So if it were the case that rationality can fix our ends, that we can determine, hey, this list of ends are in fact the objectively rational ones, right? And just in virtue of the fact that they are the rational ones, they're the good ones, right? Well, that would allow us to say that, in fact, there is some way of ultimately adjudicating disagreements between people that have different moral values. The idea is that, well, use your reason. If both of you are using your reason, you'll both be able to come to this, ultimately reason your way to this objectively correct list of values, right? And if that were the case, there wouldn't be a really robust difference in terms of the epistemic status of facts, where we can use science to determine what the right facts are, and values, where we can use reason itself to determine what the right values are. But Railton doesn't think that that would be the right account of rationality. He in fact thinks that the instrumental view of rationality is probably the right one. And instead, he's going to develop a different type of criticism of the fact-value distinction. He thinks that the fact-value distinction overgeneralizes. Now, Railton is going to argue this by saying that beliefs about facts also require values. So an instrumental view of rationality, remember, treats belief formation in the same way that it treats other processes, right? What reasons I have for adopting a given belief will depend on the ends that I have. So if I do not desire that my beliefs be justified or that they be true, then the instrumental view of rationality will not imply that I ought to believe only true or justified things, right? In fact, if I had the desire to only believe things about, red objects, for example, the instrumental view of rationality would say that, well, I have all kinds of reasons to adopt beliefs about these red things, but I have no reason to adopt beliefs about anything else, right? The reason for this is that the instrumental view of rationality says that we can't fix our ends. We can only determine what the best means are for achieving those ends. And that applies in the belief formation case too, in the beliefs that we form about facts. So Railton says, even the claims about empirical science could be rationally rejected by someone who just doesn't care about justifying his beliefs or about believing only true things. And so there's nothing special, Railton is going to argue, about, at least from the standpoint of instrumental rationality, about values, right? In both cases, you have to have a certain set of values in the background to fix the ends that will then, instrumental rationality will help you achieve the means for. So that's the way that Railton thinks that we can deal with the fact-value distinction, right? In fact, every process that we go through, whether we're trying to come up with the right beliefs for facts or the right beliefs about values, in both cases we need some values in the background, right? But there's a stronger way of putting the fact-value distinction that Railton needs another argument to deal with, right? And this comes from David Hume and this notion of categoricity. Now, Hume did not call this categoricity. He said that there was a practical notion of morality, but he meant something like what Kant means by categoricity, and we've used this notion a number of times in the class. So the basic argument here would say, if moral facts existed, then they would have to provide a reason for moral action for all rational beings, regardless of their desires. Remember, Kant was really big on this point, but he got it ultimately from Hume. It was this notion that moral facts have to be practical in this important sense. They have to provide practical reasons for beings that recognize their existence. But instrumental rationality is all we have. So Hume thought that this instrumental view of rationality was correct. We can't fix our ends. We can only find the means to fulfill our ends, right? And that's what rationality is all about. And Kant responded, by the way, by saying that no, in fact, there's an expanded role for what rationality is that can help us fix the means, right? But Hume disagreed. So, given that this instrumental view of rationality is correct, the kinds of categorical reasons that might be provided by moral facts simply don't exist. There just aren't these kinds of reasons. And Hume is famous for saying that it would be no more rational to prefer the destruction of the entire world over the scratching of my finger, right? You cannot set the ends of what is valuable. It just so happens that we all tend to have the same kinds of ends, right? And so given the fact that these moral facts would need to provide this kind of reason that nothing in the world has, right? This is supposed to be a reason that moral facts don't exist. Railton's response here is to use something from Hume's own system of logic. So he says, look, Hume is right to think there's some connection between valuing something and having a positive attitude toward it, which therefore provides an instrumental reason for action. But he says that Hume has not shown that valuing something provides an instrumental reason for it in the sense that there is a necessary conceptual connection between valuing and having a reason. And as Railton points out, even according to Hume, justice is a kind of value, but it doesn't follow from that fact, the fact that it's a value, that every rational being, no matter what his desires, who believes that an act will be just, right, will have an instrumental reason to perform it. And why is that? Well, as Hume argues, it's possible to imagine what you might call a sensible knave. That is, somebody who understands what morality is all about, but just doesn't care about morality. Now, a sensible knave is a person who understands the demands of morality, but simply doesn't want to act according to it. If we thought that moral imperatives were categorical, that is, they're inescapable and they don't depend on anything about you, like it doesn't matter who you are or what's required to live your life. If you have an obligation, you have to fulfill it no matter what, right? It overrides everything else. If this were the case, the sensible knave would be conceptually impossible, because you would have to say basically that the sensible knave doesn't really understand what is morally required of him. Because after all, if moral demands were categorical like this, as soon as you recognize them, you have an inescapable reason to act in accordance with them. Well, then it must be the case that anytime you understand the demands of morality, you're motivated to act, right? And you see it as a reason to act. But the knave, by hypothesis, is somebody who doesn't do that. They go, yeah, I know that's required of me, but I'm not going to do it. I don't really care, right? Now, the fact that the sensible knave is conceivable seems to prove something. He thinks that, that is, Railton thinks, that our concept of moral imperatives is not that they are categorical. In fact, there is some connection between morality, reasons, and motivation, but the connection is contingent, right? Recognizing that we have some moral obligation typically is something that we see as a reason for action, but it's conceivable that it might not be. And similarly, recognizing that we have a reason for action usually implies that we have a motivation for that action, right? But that is not conceptually required, right? It's just a contingent thing that, in fact, as a matter of our current psychology, it's pretty common to associate those things, but it's not conceptually required. So as Railton puts this, if moral imperatives aren't categorical, this means that an objectivist, right, somebody like Railton who wants to argue for moral realism, can adopt a purely instrumental interpretation of morality, or sorry, of rationality, right, without thinking that there's some deep distinction between facts and values, right? Moral facts, whatever they are, don't need to have this special quality that a lot of philosophers, especially anti-realists, think they can't have, right? Railton's response is basically to say, look, there's no conceptual requirement that these moral facts have this crazy quality that you think is so important, right? And that you think is incompatible with current science. And given that that's possible, right? That's the conceiving of a sensible knave who recognizes the demands of morality but doesn't want to act in accordance with it. Assuming that's possible, right? We don't, in fact, have a conceptual requirement that morality act this way, that there's this tight connection between morality, reasons, and motivation. We just covered two epistemic arguments for the fact-value distinction, but there are a bunch of metaphysical arguments for the fact-value distinction as well. So these metaphysical arguments, though, mainly apply to non-naturalists. So suppose that G.E. Moore was right, and moral facts are irreducible and sui generis. They're their own type of thing, right? Well, if that were the case, then that kind of position needs to deal with this objection from ontological simplicity that we covered when we talked about Blackburn. Also supervenience, which Blackburn also argued for, and moral explanation, which is an argument that we got from Gilbert Harman. So those possible objections would be a big deal for a moral realist if this were the only possible view about the metaphysical relationship between moral facts and descriptive facts, between facts and values, right? But we do not need to take this view, Railton thinks. So these are possible problems for the moral realist, and the question is, what justifies our positing the existence of moral facts? Why should we include them in our ontology? Well, Railton thinks that the same general considerations apply to moral facts that apply to other ones. In particular, we postulate a realm of facts in virtue of the contribution they would make to the a posteriori explanation of certain features of our experience. So these posited facts are necessary, he thinks, in some cases, to explain the coherence, stability, and intersubjectivity of sense experience. There are all these things that we tend to have in common in our experience, and when we are justified in positing a fact, it is because that fact explains why we have these experiences, why they tend to be coherent and stable. This is as opposed to something being a mere phenomenon or a hallucination, right, which is not caused by anything external to us, but is rather caused by our own mind. Well, if we're going to have a successful account of these facts, they must have two criteria, right? So they must meet two criteria, I should say. They will be independent, that is, reality should actually have those features independent of our attitudes, and we should at least have some ability to interact with them, right? They should provide some feedback in our experience. So we should not posit the existence of facts for which we cannot possibly have any evidence because they don't play any causal role in the explanation of our experience, or facts that where we don't actually have any evidence that they are independent of us, that they are anything more than our mere hallucinations. So Railton thinks there are, in principle, cases where we should posit the existence of moral facts, but those things, that posit needs to be well-grounded and justifiable, right? So it needs to be shown how moral facts can be explanatory and how they can fit into a scientific picture of the world. To do that, we're going to have to show what moral facts reduce to. Now, Railton's strategy is to provide a nested account of moral goodness. So we'll start with moral goodness itself. Moral goodness is defined in terms of non-moral goodness, and we'll get into the specifics of each of these steps. Non-moral goodness, in turn, is defined in terms of a person's objective interest, and objective interest is defined in terms of subjective interest. So we'll start off with subjective interest here. A person's subjective interest, Railton says, is her interests, her wants, her desires, right? It's the things that she wants, the things that she has a goal or that are already fixed in terms of her ends, right? So a subjective interest then, Railton thinks, supervenes on the object of our desire, the thing we want, and our disposition to have a positive attitude toward it, right? It depends on those things, and it may even be totally reducible to those things. He's a little cagey about this. This reduction, though, this reduction base would be, if you can notice, perfectly naturalistic. So it's perfectly descriptively fine and compatible with science to say that people desire things. It's also perfectly fine and compatible with science to say that people have a disposition toward having a positive attitude toward things. Those are non-moral facts about the world, right, that have something to do with somebody's psychological state. Now, this subjective interest, though, is only our starting point. It's not enough to ground moral goodness or even non-moral goodness, since there are cases where we wish we knew more, or we desired to desire something different from what we currently desire, etc. So Railton's going to build an objective account of self-interest in order to deal with these possible problems with subjective interest. For a person to have an objective interest, Railton says, is for them to have an objectified subjective interest. So take person A. So this is a person with a subjective interest. They have some desire for something and some disposition to have a positive attitude toward that thing they desire. Now, as Railton says, define A plus as A, but with a bunch of extra stuff, right? So we've got A, this person, define A plus, this like souped up person, right? It's all in our imagination, right? But this is useful for figuring out what an objective interest might be. He says A plus would be somebody that's like A, except with unqualified cognitive and imaginative powers and full factual and nomological, that is having to do with physical laws, information about his physical and psychological constitution, capacities, circumstances, history, and so on. He has complete and vivid knowledge of himself and his environment, and his instrumental rationality is in no way defective. So we're imagining this person who basically has everything set. They have a perfect understanding about their past and their future. They're perfectly instrumentally rational, right? And more than that, though, they have all the desires that A has, right? And all the interests, subjective interests that A has. So Railton says that A's objectified subjective interest is what A plus would want for A. So if we could imagine this person that was operating with perfect rationality, right, who knew all the information, what that person would want for you, right, given your desires, is what your objective interest is. And this is supposed to rule out cases where people want things that are not good for them, or they want things, but they don't really want those things. They'd like to give them up. So it rules out cases of what's called akrasia, where somebody recognizes they need to do something, but they just aren't motivated to do it. And it rules out cases where of like addiction and other cases like that, right? So this is trying to figure out what is in somebody's objective interest by imagining somebody who had all these features already. What would they want for this person? I'll give you an example here. Railton talks about this guy, Lonnie, who desires to drink a cup of milk. So the situation is that he's traveling in a foreign country and he's really tired and he's dehydrated, and he has this desire when before he lays down to bed that he really wants to drink a glass of milk, and he believes that drinking the glass of milk will fix his dehydration and make him feel a lot better. However, suppose it is objectively the case that if Lonnie drinks the milk, he's going to throw up everywhere. And in fact, he'll be made really sick, and it won't cure his dehydration, and it's going to make his day really bad, right? Well, in this case, Lonnie wants something, but as a result of a lack of full information, he doesn't realize that, in fact, that the outcome of him obtaining that want, right, of fulfilling that desire, would be bad for him. And alternatively, suppose it were the case that despite the fact that Lonnie doesn't know this, it would be the case that he would be happy and satisfied if instead of drinking milk, he drank water, right? Well, even though Lonnie doesn't desire water right now, right? Because Lonnie, after all, desires, it's part of his subjective set, right? That he desires in his mind, right? Milk. It would be better off for him if he drank water. Well, Lonnie plus is Lonnie with all the same desires, right? But full information about the situation, including what the effect of drinking the milk would be and what the effect of drinking the water would be. And so Lonnie plus knows that Lonnie would be better off drinking the water. So he can see basically that this is the objective state of affairs. And so what we would say then is what Lonnie plus would want for Lonnie, namely to drink water instead of milk, is what is in Lonnie's objective interest, right? So Lonnie's subjective interest is to drink the milk, but his objective interest is to drink the water in virtue of the fact that a souped up Lonnie with perfect rational powers and all the information in the world would know that this would be better for Lonnie, right? So from this, he's going to derive, he's got now this notion of objective self-interest, of objective interest, and he's going to use this to build a theory of non-moral goodness, and then build a theory of moral goodness from that. Non-moral goodness, then, is defined in terms of objective interest. And when I say non-moral interest, I don't mean amoral or immoral interest, right? What I mean is an interest that is just irrelevant for the purposes of morality, right? But is still maybe something that would be good for you if you had it. So for example, it would be in my objective interest to have a nice cup of coffee in the morning, even though it's not in my moral interest, right? It's just something that would be good for me. So the reason why we need an account of non-moral goodness, though, is that Railton, as I mentioned, is going to be defining moral goodness in terms of non-moral goodness. So now we've got to define non-moral goodness in terms of something else that we know about. Well, we just defined objective interest, right? Talking about Lonnie and all that. So we know what objective interest is. Non-moral goodness is just defined based on that. So he says, X is non-morally good for A if and only if X would satisfy an objective interest of A's. So if somebody has an objective interest, basically, that means that it is non-morally good for them to obtain that, to have that interest fulfilled. At this point, Railton recognizes that there's a potential objection here, which is that he's defining what it is for something to be good or to be valuable for a person, but he hasn't really accounted for the role of oughts or shoulds in a moral theory. So typically we think that this is a big part of morality when we say that people ought not murder or that they should give to charity, right? Those are important features of morality, and if we couldn't include those or make sense of them, that would be a real defect of the theory. So how can there be an objective account of what one ought to do, right? Especially on this version of naturalistic or reductionistic moral realism. Well, Railton's answer is to contextualize the word ought. So there are lots of cases where we use the word ought, and it doesn't look like it's going to create problems for the possibility of reductionism in that discourse, right? So the example he uses is in architecture. He says, for a house that gets the sort of snow loads that one did, right? The rafters ought to have been at least 2 by-8s, not 2 by-6s, right? Now, notice that saying the ought in this case doesn't seem like a big problem for a naturalistic reduction of architecture, right? It seems like you can account for what this ought means by putting it in a conditional form. So the ought here can just be reduced to a descriptive statement about engineering, right? That if a roof of that design is to withstand the snow load that one bore, right? The snow that was on that one, then it must be framed with rafters at least 2 by 8 in cross section, right? Basically, if you want to do this, then you should do that, right? What this is basically applying the instrumental notion of rationality to morality and saying that it's no more than that, right? Just like architectural oughts like this depend on and are made sensible by a kind of instrumental theory of rationality. If you want to make this house's roof stay up, you should use this type of rafter and not this other type, right? Moral oughts are similar, right? When we say that one ought to give to charity, we are presuming that people have a certain set of values, right? And that's the way that Railton is going to account for oughts, right? They are they're an expression of hypothetical rationality given a certain set of moral values. Railton now is going to define moral goodness in terms of non-moral goodness. So here's how he defines it. He says, moral good is what would be rationally approved of were the interests of all potentially affected individuals counted equally under circumstances of full and vivid information. This is what it is to be good. Notice that Railton is doing exactly what Moore said you can't do, right? And notice what he's doing, how he's gotten here, right? He has tried to overcome these problems that seem to indicate that morality, whatever it is, can't be reducible, can't be analyzed, right? Given us reasons to think, hey, maybe there isn't this robust distinction between facts and values, and maybe we can be justified in positing the existence of moral facts. And given those considerations, if those arguments are successful, right, well, then you can provide a potential definition of what good is. And whether it's going to be a proper one, whether it's the correct one, will just depend on whether we think that this satisfies what intuitively seems like the necessary requirements of moral goodness, and also whether it satisfies those other scientific requirements of why should we posit this thing's existence? Is it explanatorily useful, right? So this is his answer, though. This is his substantive answer to what moral goodness should be defined as. This account has a number of things that recommend it over an account like Moore's, which is non-naturalistic. Note that first, this is the basic structure of the account. Facts about moral goodness will reduce to facts about non-moral goodness, right? And facts about non-moral goodness will in turn reduce to facts about objective interests, and facts about objective interests will in turn reduce to facts about subjective interests, which in turn reduce to facts about our desires and our dispositions. For each of these reductions, there's a plausible reason why one of these things should reduce to the other. And importantly, they reduce to something that is naturalistically and scientifically respectable. We talk about our desires and our dispositions all the time. These things seem like they exist, and there's no reason to be especially skeptical of them. As a result, this view has some advantages over non-naturalist views. So for one, it seems like it can meet the supervenience challenge. Remember that the supervenience challenge says basically that moral facts depend on natural facts, but it's hard to say how or why or what the metaphysical relationship is. Well, this account gives us a fairly clear understanding of how the relationship between moral facts and natural facts shakes out. The basic idea is that it's reduced, right? It's metaphysically or possibly semantically identical to ultimately facts about our desires and our dispositions. So that's one potential upside of this view. It can account for that supervenience challenge. Another is that it meets the challenge of ontological simplicity. So we talked about how Occam's razor implies that we should not accept accounts of morality that produce way too many extra facts that aren't necessary to posit. Well, our interests on this view simply reduce to descriptive facts and our desires about and how they can be satisfied, right? So there are no new ontological categories, right? At every level, we can account for the facts at that level exclusively and without remainder with facts at a lower level, right? All the way down to something that looks like it is scientifically respectable. So there aren't additional ontological danglers that would threaten this account, right? That would make us prefer an alternate, more simple account. Finally, it meets the explanatory challenge. And here Reilton says the following. When we seek to explain why people act as they do, why they have certain values or desires, and why sometimes they are led into conflict and other times into cooperation, it comes naturally to common sense, and in fact to social science, alike to talk in terms of people's interests. These things do not seem to be explanatorily irrelevant. In fact, they are often quite relevant in explaining why people do what they do. An important question then is whether this is a scientific account of morality. Well, in one sense it is. Moral goodness, if we consider it to be social rationality, if we say that's what moral goodness really is, it plays a role in psychological, sociological, economic, and political explanations. So he says, for example, when a society departs substantially from social rationality, this may lead to characteristic forms of social unrest or political repression. And these explanations would not simply involve people believing something to be socially rational, right? Instead, it would be the fact that their social setup, right, that their political, economic, sociological, psychological setup, right, the way they run their society departs from social rationality in that it doesn't fulfill people's interests or fulfills them really unequally in ways that can cause them to not have their desires fulfilled and for them to have negative dispositions about the things that they ought to desire, right? And so those facts about their desires and dispositions, and accordingly the kinds of things we can say about their interests, are ultimately the things that make a causal difference, that are things that we can use in an explanation, in a scientific explanation of why certain things happen in a society. So as a result, this view of moral goodness, this definition, right, is one that is potentially scientifically respectable. It's something that where we have a good enough reason to posit things as being morally good or morally bad, and that moral goodness and badness actually plays a role in the explanation of these various social phenomena. So the exact inputs and outputs of social rationality would, of course, Reilton says, have to be determined empirically. So the inputs here are what people's individual interests actually are, and he thinks those will vary substantially across different people given their different desires and their different dispositions. The outputs here would be what fulfilling or failing to fulfill various measures of social rationality would do for a society, right? And all of those things have to be determined empirically, Reilton thinks. We can't just think about them and discern them from reason alone. Another potential benefit of this account is that it allows us to respond to the argument from disagreement, or if, as Mackey put it, the argument from relativity. So reducing morality to something scientific is the major way that this can happen. Note that when somebody makes an argument from disagreement, when they say, look, there are all these people that disagree about what's right and wrong, what they often do is they make an argument to the best explanation. They say, what is the best explanation of why there's such persistent disagreement, right? Well, one explanation, according to Mackey, is that people are not actually disagreeing about some objective set of moral values that they're all trying to get at. Instead, they are just expressing their commitments to various different ways of life. But as Reilton points out, there are, of course, contemporary cultures and subcultures within our culture that reject various parts of science. And it's definitely not the best explanation in that case of disagreement to say that the persistent disagreement about these scientific issues is a reason for anti-realism about science, right? We don't say that just because there's a certain percentage of the United States who are flat earthers, that therefore the curvature of the earth is a matter determined by people's attitudes, right? Instead, what we say is, well, those people are wrong. There's some objective fact about the curvature of the earth, and so they've got it incorrect. Now, note that if this is the right account of morality and it's scientifically respectable, there should be no reason to treat this aspect of science differently from other aspects of science, right? We should think that when people have these disagreements, they're disagreeing about the same subject matter, and given a certain set of desires and dispositions, we can figure out what would be in people's objective interest in a way that ought to, at least at the end of inquiry, settle what is socially rational and what is worth pursuing as a society, which is what, after all, Railton thinks moral goodness is. So to sum up, Railton is a moral realist, he's a cognitivist, he's a reductionist, and a naturalist as a result of being a reductionist. He defines morality in terms of social rationality. Moral goodness is what is socially rational. He defines social rationality in terms of individual rationality, what is rational for an individual to pursue. And he defines individual rationality in terms of an individual's interest given full information, right? Their objective interest. And finally, he defines their objective interest in terms of their subjective interest, which is in turn defined by their desires and dispositions. Now, for more information on reductionist moral realism, you should check out Alex Miller's Contemporary Metaethics, Chapter 9, especially sections 9.5 and 9.6, where Railton's specific view is discussed. For some objections to Railton's view, you should check out 9.8 and through 9.10 of the same volume. And for a critical response to this type of view, because there are a bunch of other potential full information accounts of well-being, you should see this article that I've included in the syllabus by David Sobel.